To everyone who believed in this vision from the beginning, thank you. To Graham, who's been my right hand through every impossible decision. To Tessa, who's brought a level of strategic thinking that's genuinely transformed how we operate. And to everyone on this team who made tonight possible. This is your win as much as mine. Natalie Rivers sat 3 seats down from the man she loved, holding a glass of wine she hadn't touched in 20 minutes, and felt the floor drop out from underneath her. Not because Ethan Wade was giving a speech, not even because he'd forgotten to thank her, but because he genuinely didn't know he had. And sitting there, in a room full of people celebrating a deal she had built with her own hands, Natalie realized something that made her skin go cold. Ethan had no idea what she'd done. He thought this success was his. He believed it. She didn't cry. She didn't stand up. She didn't say a word. She just sat there, watching the man she'd spent 6 years building, and started counting everything he didn't know. The restaurant was the kind of place Ethan liked. Exposed brick, low lighting, a wine list that required a degree to navigate. The kind of place where success tasted like aged Cabernet and sounded like polite laughter echoing off vaulted ceilings. Natalie had made the reservation 3 weeks ago, back when Ethan told her the investor deal was almost closed. She'd known it was already done. She'd spent 4 months making sure of it. The lead investor's chief of staff was a woman named Caroline, and Caroline didn't trust men like Ethan. She'd told Natalie that explicitly during their first call. He reminds me of every overconfident founder I've ever watched crash and burn. But Caroline trusted Natalie, so Natalie had spent 4 months building that trust. She'd read Caroline's op-eds on ethical investment frameworks. She'd listened when Caroline talked about her mother's Alzheimer's diagnosis. She'd sent a handwritten note after Caroline's team launched a new sustainability initiative. And when Caroline finally told her investment committee that Ethan's firm was worth the risk, it wasn't because of Ethan's pitch. It was because Natalie had made a promise. If anything goes wrong, I'll make it right. Ethan didn't know Caroline's name. He thought the deal closed because his vision was compelling. Natalie looked down at her wine glass and watched the surface ripple slightly from the bass of the music. She thought about saying something. She thought about leaning over, touching Ethan's arm and whispering, "You forgot to mention the 4 months I spent keeping this deal alive." But she didn't. Because somewhere in the back of her mind, a question was forming that she didn't want to answer yet. Would he even believe her? Ethan finished his speech to applause. He smiled the way he always did when he was proud of himself. Boyish, a little bashful, like he couldn't quite believe his own luck. People stood. Someone clinked a glass. Graham raised his bourbon and said something about loyalty and long-term vision. And Ethan glowed. Natalie clapped. She smiled. She did what she always did. She made it easy for him. Across the table, Tessa Moreau was laughing at something one of the junior associates said. Tessa had been with the firm for 5 weeks. She was sharp, loud, unapologetically confident. The kind of woman who introduced herself with her accomplishments and made you feel like you should be grateful she was in the room. Ethan loved her. Not romantically. Natalie could handle romantic. This was worse. He loved her the way you love someone who confirms what you want to believe about yourself. Tessa told Ethan he was a visionary. She told him his instincts were disruptive in the best way. She told him that the client retention framework she'd introduced was going to change the game. Natalie had designed that framework 2 years ago. She knew because she still had the original notes saved in a folder labeled Client Systems, Draft 3. She'd handed it to Ethan casually one night after dinner, the way she handed him everything. Like it wasn't precious. Like it was just something she'd thought of, no big deal. He'd skimmed it, nodded, said this is good, and then never mentioned it again. Until Tessa showed up. Tessa had repackaged it. New terminology. Slicker visuals. The same bones, different skin. And when she presented it in a leadership meeting 2 weeks ago, Ethan had called it innovative. Natalie had been on the call. She'd stayed on mute. She'd watched Ethan's face light up the way it used to light up when she showed him something new, back when he still looked at her like she had answers. Now he looked at Tessa that way. And the worst part, the part that made Natalie's chest feel too tight to breathe, was that Tessa wasn't smarter. She wasn't more strategic. She wasn't even original. She was just loud. She claimed her ideas like they were land she'd conquered. She put her name on everything. She made people say Tessa said instead of we figured out. And it worked. Natalie looked at Tessa now, laughing with her head thrown back, and felt something she didn't want to name. Not jealousy. Something colder. Recognition. She was watching herself be replaced by someone who'd learned the one lesson Natalie never had. Visibility isn't earned by being good. It's taken by being loud. Ethan slid into the seat beside her, flushed from the attention, still riding the high of his own speech. He kissed her temple without looking at her. "You okay? You've been quiet?" Natalie smiled. "I'm good, just tired." "Yeah, it's been a crazy few weeks." He squeezed her knee. "I couldn't have done this without you, you know." The words landed like stones in her stomach. He meant them. That was the cruelty of it. He thought he was being generous. He thought, "I couldn't have done this without you," was the same thing as, "You did this." Natalie touched his hand. "I know." He kissed her again, distracted, already turning back toward the table, toward Graham, toward the people whose attention fed him. And Natalie sat there, still smiling, and thought about all the things Ethan didn't know. He didn't know that Graham had almost left. Twice. The first time was 8 months ago, after Ethan made a unilateral decision to pivot the firm's service model without consulting him. Graham had called Natalie at 11 at night, furious, talking about dissolving the partnership. Natalie had listened for an hour. She hadn't defended Ethan. She'd just listened. And then she'd asked Graham what he needed to stay. Graham told her respect, decision, making power, acknowledgement. Natalie spent the next 2 weeks creating opportunities for Ethan to ask Graham's opinion. She'd frame questions at dinner. "What do you think Graham would say about this?" And let Ethan believe the insights were his own. She scheduled informal coffee meetings between them and prepped Ethan on what to say to rebuild trust. It worked. Graham stayed. Ethan never knew he'd almost lost him. The second time was 3 months ago. Same pattern. Different issue. Same resolution. Natalie had become a mediator in a conflict Ethan didn't know existed. And Graham, loyal, steady Graham, had stayed because of her, not because of Ethan. Ethan believed his partnership was unshakable. He toasted it tonight like it was destiny. Natalie knew it was architecture, and she'd built it. She thought about the client Ethan loved to brag about, the one whose contract was worth 30% of the firm's revenue. Ethan told people he'd landed them with a brilliant pitch about long-term value alignment. That wasn't how it happened. Natalie had met their COO, a woman named Diane, at a conference Ethan didn't attend. They'd ended up in the same workshop on stakeholder ethics, and afterward they'd gone for coffee. Diane was funny, sharp, deeply skeptical of consultants. She told Natalie that most firms talked about values but operated on ego. Natalie didn't pitch her. She just listened. They stayed in touch. Casual emails. Articles Natalie thought Diane would find interesting. A congratulations note when Diane's team won an industry award. It wasn't strategy. It was just attention. And then one day, Diane's company needed a consultant. Diane called Natalie. Not Ethan, Natalie. Natalie had been the one to say, "Let me introduce you to my partner, I think we can help." Ethan did the pitch. He was great at pitches. But the reason Diane said yes wasn't the pitch. It was because Natalie had spent a year proving that someone in Ethan's firm actually gave a damn. Ethan didn't know that. He thought Diane liked him. Diane had told Natalie 3 months into the contract, "I'm only staying because of you. If you ever leave, I'm gone." Natalie had never told Ethan that either. She looked around the table, at the junior associate who'd almost quit last year until Natalie spent 2 hours listening to her talk about burnout, and then carefully, gently, scripted the exact words Ethan should say to make her feel valued. At the senior strategist who praised Ethan's emotional intelligence, not knowing that Natalie had coached Ethan through every difficult conversation. At the board members who thought Ethan's instincts were sharp, not knowing Natalie had spent 6 years translating her instincts into his voice. This entire room, this entire firm, was built on invisible labor, hers, and no one knew. Not because they were malicious, but because Natalie had made it invisible. She'd handed Ethan her thoughts and let him wear them as his own. She'd solved problems before they became visible. She'd edited his emails, refined his strategies, course-corrected his mistakes, all while standing just outside the frame. She told herself it was love. But sitting there, listening to Ethan laugh at something Tessa said, Natalie felt the story she'd been telling herself start to crack. This wasn't love. This was erasure. And she'd been the one holding the eraser. The dinner eventually ended. People filtered out into the cool night air, still buzzing, still celebrating. Ethan shook hands and made plans for follow-up meetings. Tessa left in an Uber with two of the associates, already talking about momentum and next steps. Natalie walked beside Ethan toward their car, her heels clicking against the pavement, and felt the weight of the evening settle into her chest like stones. Ethan was talking about the future, about scaling, about legacy. "I think we're ready for Series B," he was saying. "Tessa thinks we should start building the deck now, get ahead of it." Tessa thinks. Natalie stopped walking. Ethan took 3 more steps before he noticed. He turned back. "You okay?" She looked at him. Really looked. At the man she'd loved for 6 years. The man she'd built. The man who had no idea what she'd given him. "Do you know what I do?" she asked. Ethan blinked. "What do you mean?" "For the firm. Do you know what I actually do?" He laughed, uncomfortable. "Of course I do. You're my partner. You keep everything running." "Running how?" "I don't, Natalie, what's this about?" She shook her head. "Nothing, never mind." But it wasn't nothing. It was the question she'd been afraid to ask for 6 years, finally spoken out loud. And his answer, vague, dismissive, affectionate in the way you're affectionate towards something you don't actually see, told her everything she needed to know. Ethan didn't know what she did, because he'd never had to. That night, Natalie lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening to him breathe. She thought about the woman she used to be, the one before Ethan, the one who had opinions and boundaries and a voice that didn't need permission to speak. She thought about when she'd started editing herself, when she'd started offering her ideas like suggestions instead of statements, when she'd started saying we instead of I. It had been gradual, a slow dissolve. She told herself it was partnership, that relationships required compromise, that love meant making space for someone else to grow. But she'd made so much space she'd disappeared. And now someone else was standing in the shape she used to occupy. Natalie turned her head and looked at Ethan. He was beautiful in sleep, peaceful, untroubled. He had no idea what was coming, because Natalie didn't either. Not yet. But lying there in the dark, she started counting. Not grievances, not anger, just facts. She counted the clients who stayed because of her, the employees who stayed because of her, the strategies that only worked because she made them work, the relationships she maintained, the crises she de-escalated, the invisible infrastructure that held everything upright. She counted what she knew that Ethan had forgotten, what she knew that he never learned. And as the hours stretched on and the room grew lighter, Natalie realized something that felt like waking up and falling at the same time. Ethan's world didn't work without her, not because she was extraordinary, but because she'd been holding it together for so long, he'd forgotten it needed holding. She didn't know what to do with that knowledge yet, but she knew it was true. And the truth, she was starting to understand, had weight, even when no one else could see it. The next morning, Natalie woke up before Ethan and made coffee the way she always did. 2 cups. His with cream, no sugar. Hers black. She set his on the counter where he'd find it, and took hers to the small desk by the window. Ethan's laptop was open. He'd left it that way, the screen dark but still powered on. There was a draft pitch deck in his tabs. She could see it from where she sat. Normally, she would have opened it by now. She would have read through it while her coffee was still hot, made notes in the margins of her mind, and by the time Ethan asked her what she thought, casually, like he was just curious, she'd have 3 ways to make it sharper. This morning, she didn't touch it. She opened her own laptop instead and stared at her email. Nothing urgent, nothing that required her. Just the usual ambient hum of a business she'd helped build but didn't officially belong to. Ethan came out of the bedroom 20 minutes later, hair still damp from the shower, and kissed the top of her head on his way to the coffee. He saw the laptop open and smiled. "Looking at the deck?" "No," Natalie said. "Just catching up on email." He paused, mug halfway to his mouth. "You didn't want to take a look? I'm presenting it to the team tomorrow." "I'm sure it's great." Ethan waited. She could feel him waiting. This was usually the moment when she'd say something like, "Well, maybe just a quick pass," and he'd slide the laptop over with that boyish grin that meant he'd been counting on her all along. She didn't say it. She just sipped her coffee and kept scrolling. "Okay," Ethan said slowly. "Cool, yeah, I think it's in good shape." He took his coffee to the couch and opened his phone. Natalie watched him from the corner of her eye. He looked faintly unsettled, like he'd reached for something and found it an inch farther away than he remembered. She didn't explain herself. She just let the moment sit. This was how it started. Not with confrontation, not with declarations, just with absence. Small, quiet, almost unnoticeable. The kind of absence that doesn't announce itself until the shape of it starts to matter. Natalie stopped offering fixes she wasn't asked for. She stopped staying up late to edit his emails. She stopped reminding him which client liked bourbon and which one had a daughter starting college. She stopped being the infrastructure that ran so smoothly he never noticed it was there. And for the first few days, Ethan didn't notice it was gone. But then, the small things started piling up. He missed a follow-up email with a prospective client because Natalie used to flag those in his calendar, and she didn't anymore. He fumbled a reference to a board member's recent vacation because Natalie used to prep him before calls, and now she just said, "You'll be great," and left the room. He sent a proposal with a typo in the executive summary, something Natalie would have caught in her sleep, and didn't realize it until Graham mentioned it in a leadership meeting. Ethan laughed it off, said he'd been moving too fast. But Natalie saw the look in his eyes. Confusion. Just a flicker. Like he was trying to remember what used to happen that wasn't happening now. He started asking her questions he used to answer himself. Did I already send the contract to the client, or was I waiting on something? What was the name of that investor Caroline worked with, the one who's interested in sustainability plays? Do you remember what Graham said about the revenue model? I feel like I'm missing something. Natalie answered when he asked, but she didn't anticipate anymore. She didn't solve problems before they became visible. She just let them surface. And slowly, Ethan started to feel the edges of something he couldn't quite name. A discomfort, a friction. He didn't know it was her absence. He just knew something felt off. One night, 2 weeks after the dinner, Ethan looked up from his laptop and said, "You've been really quiet lately." Natalie glanced at him. "Have I?" "Yeah, I mean, you're always kind of quiet, but I don't know, you seem distant." "I'm just giving you space," she said. "You've been busy." "I'm always busy," he said, and there was something almost defensive in his voice. "That's never bothered you before." She smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "It doesn't bother me now." But it did bother him. She could see it. He wanted her to ask him about his day, to lean in, to engage the way she used to, like his work was the most fascinating thing in the world. She didn't. She just went back to her book. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, then closed his laptop harder than necessary and went to bed early. Natalie stayed on the couch, reading the same page 3 times, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace, not happiness, not satisfaction, just the quiet, steady absence of performance. She wasn't managing his emotions. She wasn't translating his needs. She wasn't making herself small so he could feel big. She was just sitting on a couch, reading a book, existing in her own space, and it felt like the first full breath she'd taken in 6 years. The information didn't come to her all at once. It had always been there, accumulating quietly in the background like sediment at the bottom of a river. But now, for the first time, Natalie was paying attention to it. She was cataloging it, not for revenge. Not yet. Just because she wanted to see the shape of the truth. She knew things Ethan had forgotten. Things he never knew in the first place. Things he thought he knew but had gotten wrong. She knew that the client retention framework Tessa presented wasn't just similar to the one Natalie designed. It was identical. Same structure. Same metrics. Same implementation phases. Tessa had found Natalie's original document in a shared folder, changed the language, added a few graphics, and presented it as her own innovation. Ethan didn't know that because he'd never actually read Natalie's original version closely enough to recognize it. She knew that the firm's largest client, Diane's company, was 3 months away from their contract renewal, and Diane had already told Natalie in a private email that she wasn't sure she wanted to continue. Not because of the work, because of Ethan. Diane had written, "He doesn't listen. Every call feels like a performance. I stay because I trust you, but I'm not sure how much longer that's enough." Ethan thought Diane loved him. He talked about their partnership like it was a model relationship. Natalie knew it was hanging by a thread. Her thread. She knew that Graham's frustration was building again. She could see it in the way he responded to Ethan's emails. Shorter, terser, less enthusiastic. She knew the signs. She'd seen them before. Graham was the kind of person who didn't explode. He just went quiet, made a decision, and left. Ethan didn't see it. He was too busy celebrating wins and chasing the next deal. But Natalie saw it. And she knew that if Graham left, the firm would lose its operational backbone. Ethan was vision. Graham was execution. Without Graham, Ethan was just a man with expensive ideas and no way to build them. She knew which employees were staying because of her and which ones were staying because of Ethan. The ratio wasn't flattering. Most of the people Ethan thought were loyal to him had privately told Natalie they'd leave if she ever did. Not because they disliked Ethan, but because Natalie was the one who made the firm feel human. She knew which board members respected Ethan and which ones tolerated him. She knew who asked for her perspective in private conversations and who only performed confidence in public. She knew the firm's financial model better than Ethan did. She'd built the original projections. She knew where the revenue was stable and where it was vulnerable. She knew which clients were likely to renew and which ones were flight risks. Ethan knew the numbers, but he didn't know the story underneath them. He didn't know that numbers were just people making decisions, and people made decisions based on relationships. And most of those relationships lived in Natalie's hands. This wasn't power she'd sought. It was just the truth of what happened when you paid attention for 6 years while someone else performed. And now that she was paying attention to her own knowledge, she realized something she'd never let herself see before. Ethan needed her more than she needed him. Not emotionally, maybe not even romantically, but structurally. His entire world rested on foundations he couldn't see. And those foundations were her. The thought didn't make her feel powerful. It made her feel sad, because it meant that everything she'd believed about their partnership had been a story she told herself to make the imbalance bearable. She wasn't his equal. She was his infrastructure. And infrastructure is only valued when it fails. Ethan started leaning on Tessa more, not because Tessa was better, but because Natalie had stopped leaning in, and Ethan needed someone to fill the space. Tessa was happy to fill it. She started appearing in more meetings, weighing in on more strategy decisions, sitting in the chair next to Ethan during leadership calls. She spoke with the kind of confidence that made people forget to ask whether she'd earned it. And Ethan ate it up. He started saying things like, "Tessa had a great insight on this, and Tessa's really helping me think differently about the client model." Natalie watched it happen with the detached curiosity of someone observing a pattern they'd already predicted. She didn't feel jealous. She felt something closer to vindication. Because she was watching Ethan choose visibility over competence, performance over substance, and it told her everything she needed to know about what he actually valued. One afternoon, Ethan told Natalie that he'd invited Tessa to a board meeting. "She's going to present the client retention framework," he said. "I think the board's going to love it." Natalie was folding laundry. She didn't look up. "That's great. You don't mind, do you? I know you usually sit in on those." "I don't usually sit in on those," Natalie said quietly. "I haven't been invited to a board meeting in 8 months." Ethan blinked. "Really? Really? Huh. I thought—" He stopped, frowned. "Well, you're always busy with other stuff. I didn't think you wanted to be in those meetings." Natalie folded a shirt in half and set it on the pile. She didn't say, "You never asked." She didn't say, "You stopped seeing me as someone who belonged in those rooms." She didn't say anything at all. She just let him sit with his own assumption. Ethan shifted his weight. "I mean, if you want to come, you can. It's not a big deal." "It's fine," Natalie said. "I'm sure Tessa will do great." But the look on Ethan's face told her he didn't feel fine. He felt vaguely guilty, though he couldn't articulate why. Like he'd done something wrong but couldn't locate the wrongness. Natalie had spent 6 years managing his guilt, soothing it before it had a chance to solidify into accountability. She wasn't doing that anymore. So the guilt just sat there, unfixed, uncomfortable. Ethan left the room. Natalie kept folding. The crack came during a leadership meeting 3 weeks later. Ethan was presenting a new client acquisition strategy to the team. It was built around Tessa's version of the retention framework. the one that used to be Natalie's. He was excited, animated. He walked the team through the phases like he'd designed them himself. Halfway through the presentation, Graham spoke up. How are we planning to implement Phase 3, the stakeholder alignment piece? Ethan glanced at his slides. That's mostly about client communication and expectation setting. Tessa, you want to walk through that? Tessa smiled. Sure. Phase 3 is about creating feedback loops with key stakeholders so we can adjust our approach in real time. It's all about agility and responsiveness. Graham didn't smile back. That's the concept. I'm asking about implementation. How do we actually build those feedback loops? Who owns the relationships? What's the cadence? What's the accountability structure? Tessa's smile faltered slightly. Well, it depends on the client. It's meant to be adaptive. Adaptive how? Just flexible, based on what each client needs. Graham leaned back in his chair. So we don't have a system. We have a framework, Tessa said, a little defensively now. A framework isn't a system. Ethan jumped in. I think what Tessa's saying is that we're building something that can scale across different client types without being overly rigid. Graham turned to Ethan. And who's going to manage that on the ground? Because right now most of our client relationships are held together by... He stopped. His eyes flicked to the screen where Natalie's name appeared in the participant list. She was on the call, camera off, muted. She'd been sitting in silence for 40 minutes. Graham's expression shifted. Natalie, you still there? Natalie unmuted. I'm here. You designed the original retention framework, right? There was a beat of silence. Ethan looked at the screen. Tessa looked at Ethan. Natalie's voice came through calm and even. I designed a version of it a couple of years ago. I don't know if it's the same one you're looking at now. Can you walk us through how Phase 3 worked in your version? Graham asked. Because I'm trying to understand how this actually functions in practice. Natalie paused. She could feel the weight of the room shifting. She could deflect. She could say she didn't remember. She could protect Ethan from the discomfort of this moment the way she'd protected him from 1,000 others. But she didn't. In the original version, Natalie said slowly, Phase 3 wasn't just a feedback loop. It was a relational accountability system. Each client was assigned a relationship lead, not the consultant doing the work, but someone whose only job was to maintain trust and surface misalignments before they became problems. The cadence was bi-weekly check-ins for the first 3 months, then monthly after that, and the accountability structure was built into our internal operations tracker so we could see, in real time, which clients were getting the attention they needed and which ones were slipping. The silence on the call was thick. Graham nodded slowly. That's a system. It worked, Natalie said. Client retention went up 18% the year we implemented it. Ethan's face had gone carefully neutral. I didn't realize you'd built out that level of detail. You didn't ask, Natalie said. Not unkindly. Just factually. One of the other senior strategists spoke up. Do we still have that system in place? No, Natalie said. It was never formalized. I was running it manually. Why didn't we formalize it? Natalie didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was in the silence. Because no one had noticed it was there. Graham looked at Ethan. We should probably talk about this offline. Ethan nodded, but his expression was strained. Yeah, good call. The meeting continued, but the energy had shifted. People were quieter, more cautious. Tessa didn't speak again, and Natalie sat on the other end of the call, camera still off, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Seen, not because she'd demanded it, not because she'd fought for it, but because the truth had weight, and when you finally stopped carrying it alone, other people could feel it too. After the call ended, Natalie closed her laptop and sat very still. She thought about the look on Ethan's face when she explained the system he didn't know existed. The look that said he was just now realizing how much he didn't know, how much he'd never bothered to ask. She thought about Graham's question, why didn't we formalize it? And the answer she didn't say out loud, because I was never given the authority to formalize anything. I was just allowed to do the work. She thought about Tessa's framework, stripped of all the operational depth that made it functional, and how easy it was to sell a concept when you didn't have to build the system underneath it. And she thought about the fact that for the first time in 6 years, someone in that room had looked past Ethan's performance and asked her directly how something actually worked. It wasn't vindication, not yet. But it was a crack. A small one. The kind that lets light in. That night, Ethan came home later than usual. He didn't say much. He poured himself a drink and sat on the couch, staring at nothing. Natalie was reading. She didn't ask him what was wrong. She'd spent 6 years asking him what was wrong. Absorbing his stress. Managing his discomfort. Tonight, she just turned the page. Eventually, he spoke. Graham called me after the meeting. Natalie looked up. He said he's frustrated. He feels like we're building strategy without operational grounding. He said we used to be better at this. Ethan rubbed his face. I don't know what he's talking about. We're doing the same stuff we've always done. Natalie set her book down. Are you? Ethan frowned. What do you mean? You used to ask me how things worked, she said quietly. You used to run ideas by me before you presented them. You used to care about the details. I still care about the details. You care about the ones that make you look good, Natalie said. You don't care about the ones that make things work. Ethan stared at her. That's not fair. Maybe not, she said. But it's true. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. He looked at her like he was seeing someone he didn't quite recognize. When did you get so cold? Natalie felt the words land. She let them sit for a moment. Then she said very gently, I'm not cold, Ethan. I'm just not performing anymore. Performing what? The version of me that made your life easier. Ethan's jaw tightened. I never asked you to perform anything. You didn't have to, Natalie said. I did it because I thought that's what love was. And now? She looked at him. Really looked. At the man she'd spent 6 years building. The man who still didn't understand what he'd taken. Now I'm trying to figure out what's left when I stop. Ethan didn't respond. He just sat there, drink in hand, looking lost. And Natalie picked up her book and kept reading, because she didn't owe him comfort anymore. She didn't owe him explanations. She didn't owe him the labor of making him feel better about not seeing her. For the first time in 6 years, she was letting him sit with the truth. And the truth was this. Ethan Wade had built an empire on a foundation he never looked at. He had mistaken her silence for agreement, her support for subordination, her love for unconditional availability. He thought he was self-made. But he was just well-supported. And now that the support was quietly withdrawing, he was starting to feel the instability he'd never noticed before. He just didn't know why yet. Natalie turned the page of her book and felt the faintest flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Not anger. Not sadness. Power. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that just stops holding things up and watches what falls. She wasn't planning to destroy him. She was just done building him. And in the space that created, the truth was starting to take shape. The announcement came during a Monday morning leadership call. Ethan's face filled the screen, lit with the kind of excitement that made him look younger, almost boyish. He'd gotten news over the weekend, he said. Big news. The kind that changed trajectories. Hartley and Stone had reached out. They were a multinational firm, the kind whose name carried weight in 3 continents. Their annual consulting budget was larger than Ethan's entire firm revenue. If they landed this contract, it would double their size overnight. Maybe more. Ethan had already had preliminary conversations with their head of operations. The chemistry was good, he said. Really good. They were looking for a firm that could help them restructure their client engagement model across all divisions. It was exactly the kind of visionary work Ethan had always wanted to lead. The pitch meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks out. Ethan looked directly into the camera, grinning. Tessa's going to lead strategy development on this. I want us thinking big. This is the kind of opportunity that defines a firm. Graham's face in the gallery view was carefully blank. Natalie, camera off as usual, said nothing. After the call ended, her phone rang within 30 seconds. Graham. She answered. Hey. This is going to be a disaster, Graham said without preamble. Natalie leaned back in her chair. Probably. You know why, right? She did. Of course she did. But she waited for Graham to say it. Diane Hartley is their COO, Graham said. The woman you've been talking to for 3 years. The one who told you she doesn't trust consultants who lead with ego? I remember, Natalie said. Does Ethan know you know her? He's never asked. Graham was quiet for a moment. Are you going to tell him? Natalie looked out the window. The morning light was the color of honey. She thought about all the times she'd stepped in before Ethan could make a mistake. All the times she'd quietly redirected him, protected him, saved him from his own blind spots. He didn't ask, she said again. Natalie, what? He's going to humiliate himself in front of the biggest prospect we've ever had. I know, and you're just going to let it happen. She heard the question underneath the question, the moral weight of it. She thought about how to answer. Finally, she said, I've spent 6 years making sure Ethan never had to face the consequences of not seeing me. Maybe it's time he did. Graham exhaled. This is going to get ugly. It already is ugly, Natalie said quietly. It's just been invisible. Graham didn't argue. He just said, Are you going to help him? He didn't ask, Natalie said for the third time. And then, softer, and I'm done answering questions he doesn't know enough to ask. She hung up and sat very still in the silence that followed. She thought about Diane, about the first time they'd met at that conference in Phoenix, both of them sitting in the back of a workshop on stakeholder ethics, both of them slightly bored by the presenter's reliance on corporate jargon. They'd made eye contact during a particularly ridiculous slide about synergistic alignment, and Diane had rolled her eyes so subtly that Natalie almost missed it. They'd gone for coffee afterward, talked for 2 hours. Diane was sharp, funny, deeply skeptical of the consulting industry. She'd told Natalie that most consultants treated companies like problems to be solved, rather than ecosystems to be understood. She said she was tired of ego-driven strategists who performed insight without doing the work. Natalie had listened. She hadn't pitched, hadn't tried to sell anything. She'd just paid attention. They stayed in touch after that. Casual at first. An article Natalie thought Diane would appreciate. A congratulations email when Diane's team won an award. A question about one of Diane's published essays on operational ethics. The relationship deepened slowly. Diane told Natalie about her frustrations with her company's leadership, about the gap between their stated values and their actual practices, about her desire to find a consulting partner who understood that culture change required more than frameworks. It required trust. And one day about 6 months ago, Diane had said, If we ever bring in outside consultants, I want you leading the relationship, not your partner, you. Natalie had asked why. Diane's answer was simple. Because you listen, and because I trust you to tell me the truth, not just what I want to hear. Natalie had told Ethan that Hartley and Stone might be a future opportunity. She'd mentioned it in passing, the way she mentioned a lot of things, casually, without emphasis, as part of the ambient background of information she carried. Ethan had nodded, distracted, and moved on to something else. He'd never asked how she knew that. He'd never asked about the relationship. He'd never thought to wonder why a company that size would even consider a firm as small as his. And now he was preparing to pitch them without her, and he had no idea he was walking into a room where the person with all the decision-making power had already decided she wouldn't work with him unless Natalie was involved. Natalie could stop this. One phone call, one conversation. She could tell Ethan everything and give him a chance to adjust. But she didn't reach for her phone. She just sat in the honey-colored light and let the future come. Ethan and Tessa spent the next 2 weeks building the pitch. Natalie heard pieces of it in passing. Ethan talking on calls late at night, his voice animated, confident. Tessa sending strategy documents back and forth, each one with subject lines like Vision Framework V4 and Transformational Roadmap, Final. The language was big. Visionary. Disruptive. All the words that sounded impressive in a conference room but meant nothing when you tried to implement them. Natalie didn't offer to look at the materials. Ethan didn't ask her to. He did ask once if she thought he should take a different approach to the relationship-building phase. I'm sure you'll be great, Natalie said. He looked at her like he was waiting for more. But she just smiled and went back to what she was doing. Ethan frowned, uncertain, then let it go. The night before the pitch, Ethan was wired. Pacing the apartment, rehearsing talking points, adjusting slides. Tessa had sent him a final pep talk email with the subject line, "We've got this." He read it aloud to Natalie, grinning. "She's right," he said. "This is the best work we've ever done. I can feel it." Natalie was cooking dinner. She didn't turn around. I hope it goes well. It's going to. He came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. This is going to change everything. She felt his warmth against her back, his certainty, his complete and total belief that he had built something extraordinary. And she felt the space between what he believed and what was actually true. I'm proud of you, she said, and she meant it. Not because he deserved pride, but because she was proud of herself for finally letting him walk into the consequences of his own choices. Ethan kissed her temple and went back to his laptop. Natalie finished cooking and thought about what was coming. She didn't feel vindictive. She didn't feel cruel. She just felt clear. The pitch meeting was at 10 in the morning. Ethan and Tessa arrived 15 minutes early, checked in with reception, and were escorted to a conference room on the 14th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A table that could seat 20. Bottled water with the Hartley and Stone logo printed on the label. Natalie wasn't there. She was at home, camera off on a different call, barely listening to the person talking about quarterly projections. But she knew what was happening. She could see it in her mind with perfect clarity, because she knew Ethan, and she knew Diane. The Hartley and Stone executive team filtered in. Head of Operations, VP of Client Services, 2 senior directors, and Diane Hartley, CO, the woman whose opinion carried more weight than anyone else's in the room. Ethan didn't recognize her. Why would he? He'd never met her. Didn't know she existed. Didn't know that the entire opportunity had come through a relationship he'd never bothered to learn about. Diane recognized the absence immediately. She scanned the room, looking for Natalie. Didn't find her. Her expression shifted. Not angry. Just disappointed. Ethan started the pitch. He was good at this part. Confident. Articulate. He talked about transformation and vision and scalable impact. He used phrases like cultural disruption and stakeholder optimization. Tessa chimed in with polished commentary about adaptive frameworks and strategic agility. It sounded impressive. If you didn't know what you were listening for, you might have been convinced. But Diane knew what she was listening for, and she wasn't hearing it. 15 minutes in, she interrupted. Her voice was polite but firm. Can I ask a clarifying question? Ethan smiled. Of course. You're talking about transformation frameworks, but I'm not hearing anything about implementation ethics. How do you ensure that the changes you're recommending don't just optimize efficiency but actually align with our stated values around stakeholder impact? Ethan blinked. It was a good question. A real question. The kind that required systemic thinking, not sales language. He pivoted smoothly. That's a great point. Our framework is built to be values agnostic, which means it adapts to whatever priorities the client organization defines as central. Diane's expression didn't change. Values agnostic. Right. We don't impose our own assumptions. We let the organization's culture guide the transformation. And if the organization's stated culture doesn't match its actual practices? Ethan hesitated. Just for a second. Then part of our work is helping leadership identify and close that gap. How? Through stakeholder engagement and transparent feedback mechanisms. Diane leaned back in her chair. That's a concept. I'm asking about implementation. How do you actually build those feedback mechanisms in a way that doesn't just become performative listening? Tessa jumped in. We use adaptive engagement strategies that allow us to iterate in real time based on stakeholder input. Diane's eyes stayed on Ethan. What does that mean in practice? Tessa opened her mouth, but nothing came out that wasn't more abstract language dressed up as an answer. Diane waited. The silence stretched. Finally, she said, I'm not hearing systemic thinking. I'm hearing sales language. Ethan's face flushed. I think there might be a miscommunication about what Where's Natalie? Diane asked. The room went very still. Ethan blinked. I'm sorry? Natalie Rivers. Where is she? Ethan looked at Tessa. Tessa looked blank. Ethan turned back to Diane, visibly confused. Do you know Natalie? Diane's surprise was genuine. Know her? She's the only reason I agreed to this meeting. Ethan's confusion deepened into something closer to panic. I'm sorry, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Natalie's my partner, but she's not involved in business development. Diane's expression went cold. That's not what she told me. I don't, Ethan stammered. When did you talk to Natalie? We've been in conversation for almost 3 years, Diane said. Her tone had shifted. The warmth was gone. She told me that if your firm ever wanted to work with Hartley and Stone, she'd be the one leading the relationship. I assumed this pitch would be built on the work she and I have already done together. Ethan looked like he'd been hit. What work? Diane stood up. The stakeholder impact framework she co-developed specifically for our industry, the relational accountability model she designed based on our operational philosophy, the cultural assessment tools we spent 6 months refining. Ethan's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Diane looked at him with something close to pity. You have no idea what I'm talking about, do you? This meeting is over. Diane's voice was calm but final. If Natalie wants to reach out, we're still interested in working with her, but I'm not interested in working with a firm that doesn't know what its own people are building. She walked out. The rest of the executive team followed, polite but detached, their faces carefully neutral. Ethan and Tessa sat alone in the conference room, surrounded by unused slides and half-empty water bottles. Neither of them spoke. The silence was deafening. Ethan called Natalie from the car. His voice was tight, controlled, but she could hear the edges of panic underneath. Why didn't you tell me you knew Diane Hartley? Natalie was still on her other call, but she muted it. You didn't ask. That's not an answer, Natalie. It's the only one I have. We just humiliated ourselves in front of the biggest opportunity we've ever had, Ethan said, and now the control was slipping. She said you've been working with her for 3 years. 3 years. How did I not know that? You didn't ask? Natalie said again. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. You stopped paying attention, Ethan. That's not fair. Maybe not, but it's true. We're supposed to be a team, Ethan said, and there was something raw in his voice now, something close to hurt. We were, Natalie said quietly. But you stopped seeing my part of it. I've always valued you. You valued what I gave you, she said. You never saw me giving it. There was a long silence. She could hear him breathing. What do you want me to say? He asked finally. I don't want you to say anything, Natalie said. I want you to see what's been in front of you the whole time. And what's that? That your business doesn't work without me, that it never did, and that you built a story about your own success that erased me from it so completely, you forgot I was ever there. Ethan's voice broke. That's not true? Then tell me what I do, Natalie said. Tell me specifically what I contribute, not you keep things running, not you're supportive. Tell me what I actually do. Silence. She waited. He didn't answer. Because he couldn't. That's what I thought, Natalie said softly. She hung up, and for the first time in 6 years she didn't feel guilty for it. Graham called her 2 hours later. We need to talk, he said. They met at a coffee shop neither of them usually went to, neutral territory. Graham was already there when she arrived, sitting in the back corner with 2 cups in front of him. He pushed one toward her as she sat down. Black, right? Right. He studied her face. You knew this was going to happen. Yes. And you let it. Yes. Graham leaned back. The firm's going to fall apart, Natalie. I know. You built half of this, maybe more. I know that too. So what do you want? The question landed in the space between them. Natalie wrapped her hands around the cup and felt its warmth seep into her palms. She thought about all the things she could say, all the ways she could soften this, make it easier, perform the version of herself that didn't ask for things, but she was done performing. I want the truth to be visible, she said. Graham nodded slowly. He's not going to admit he was wrong. He doesn't have to. The structure will show it. Graham looked at her for a long moment. You're not coming back, are you? Not unless something fundamental changes. No, Natalie said. I'm not. What happens to the firm? That's not my problem anymore, she said. And then, softer. It was never supposed to be my job to hold it together alone. Graham ran a hand through his hair. Diane's contract is up for renewal in 2 months. You know she's not going to re-sign unless you're involved. I know. And Rebecca told me last week she's looking at other jobs. She only stayed this long because of you. Natalie didn't respond. She just sipped her coffee and let Graham see the truth she'd been carrying alone for years. Jesus, Graham said quietly. You really were holding the whole thing together, weren't you? Not the whole thing, Natalie said. But enough that it's going to be visible when I stop. Graham looked out the window. I've been thinking about leaving too. Natalie wasn't surprised. Why haven't you? I kept hoping Ethan would wake up, that he'd figure out how to be a real partner instead of just a frontman. He shook his head, but I don't think he knows how. He knows how, Natalie said. He just doesn't want to. It's easier to be the visionary when someone else is doing the work. What are you going to do? Natalie thought about that. I don't know yet, but I know what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to keep building someone else's dream while mine disappears. Graham nodded. For what it's worth, I'm sorry, I should have said something earlier. I saw what was happening, I just didn't know how to name it. It's not your fault, Natalie said. I made myself invisible. I can't be angry at people for not seeing what I refuse to show. They sat in silence for a while. Then Graham said, The board's meeting next week, emergency session. Ethan's going to have to explain why we lost Hartley and Stone and why our largest existing client is threatening to walk. Natalie looked up. Diane's threatening to walk? She sent an email this morning. Said she's not renewing unless there are significant changes to the leadership structure. She didn't say what changes? No, but we both know what she means. Natalie felt something shift in her chest. Not triumph, something quieter. The feeling of a truth that had been waiting finally stepping into the light. Are you going to be at the board meeting? Graham asked. I wasn't invited. I'm inviting you, Graham said. So are 2 other board members. We want you there. Does Ethan know? Not yet. Natalie thought about it. Thought about walking into that room. About being seen after years of invisibility. About the fear and the power of it. Okay, she said. I'll be there. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 4 in the afternoon. Natalie joined remotely. Camera on this time. She wore a dark blazer. Her hair was pulled back. She looked calm, composed, unshakable. The board members appeared one by one in the gallery view. Graham, 2 senior advisors, the CFO, and Ethan, sitting alone in the main conference room, looking smaller than Natalie had ever seen him. The board chair, a woman named Carolyn, opened the meeting. Her voice was measured but serious. We're here to discuss recent developments that have raised concerns about the firm's strategic direction and operational stability. Ethan, I understand you want to address what happened with Hartley and Stone. Ethan cleared his throat. He looked tired. I take full responsibility for the outcome of that pitch. There was a miscommunication about our internal processes and relationship management. I'm committed to making sure it doesn't happen again. Carolyn nodded. Can you explain the nature of the miscommunication? Ethan hesitated. It turns out that Natalie had an existing relationship with their COO that I wasn't aware of. If I'd known, I would have approached the pitch differently. One of the advisors spoke up. Why weren't you aware? Ethan faltered. It wasn't communicated to me. Graham's voice cut in, quiet but firm. That's not accurate. Ethan looked at him sharply. What? Natalie mentioned Hartley and Stone as a potential opportunity 6 months ago. I was in the room. You said it sounded interesting and moved on to something else. You didn't ask about the relationship. You didn't ask how she knew them. You just assumed it was background noise. Ethan's face flushed. I don't remember that. I do, Graham said. Because I asked Natalie about it afterward. She told me she'd been building a relationship with their COO for years. I assumed you knew. Carolyn turned to Natalie. Is that accurate? Natalie unmuted. Yes. Can you walk us through that relationship? Natalie took a breath. I met Diane Hartley 3 years ago at a conference. We stayed in touch. Over time, we developed a professional relationship built on shared values around ethical operations and stakeholder impact. About 6 months ago, she told me that if her company ever brought in consultants, she wanted me leading the relationship. I mentioned it to Ethan in passing, but he didn't follow up, so I didn't pursue it further. Did you know Ethan was planning to pitch Hartley and Stone? Yes. He announced it in a leadership meeting 2 weeks ago. Did you tell him about your relationship with Diane at that point? No. Why not? Natalie met Carolyn's eyes through the screen. Because he didn't ask. And because I've spent 6 years offering information and insights that were absorbed into his narrative without acknowledgement. I was tired of doing work that was invisible. The room was silent. Carolyn's expression was unreadable. That's a significant statement. It's the truth, Natalie said simply. Another board member spoke up. Can you be more specific about the work you're referring to? And this was it. The moment Natalie had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. The moment when the truth she'd been carrying alone finally had witnesses. She spoke calmly, precisely, without emotion. I designed the client retention framework that's currently attributed to our strategic advisor Tessa Moreau. I built the original version 2 years ago, including the relational accountability model and implementation structure. Tessa repackaged it, but the foundational work was mine. She paused. No one interrupted. I've maintained a relationship with our largest client, Diane's predecessor at her previous company, for 4 years. That client represents 30% of our annual revenue. Their COO told me explicitly she stays because of me, not because of Ethan. Another pause. I've mediated conflicts between Ethan and Graham twice when the partnership was on the verge of dissolving. Ethan doesn't know about either of those because I handled them informally. Graham's face confirmed it. I've ghost-edited most of Ethan's major proposals for the last 3 years. I've coached him through difficult client conversations. I've maintained relationships with investors and board members that he believes are based on his own credibility. She kept going. Catalog after catalog. Not with anger. Just with clarity. I've built the operational systems that allow this firm to function. I've resolved employee conflicts before they reached Ethan's attention. I've kept the culture stable while he focused on vision. She stopped. Let it settle. And none of that has ever been formally acknowledged. I have no title, no equity, no decision-making authority. I exist in this firm as infrastructure, invisible until it fails. The silence that followed was absolute. Carolyn spoke first. Why didn't you bring this up sooner? Natalie smiled. It was small. Sad. Because I thought that's what partnership looked like. I thought if I just kept giving, eventually I'd be seen. But I was wrong. I wasn't building a partnership, I was enabling someone to take credit for work they didn't do. Ethan's face had gone pale. That's not fair, Natalie. She looked at him. Really looked. Tell me which part isn't true. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Tell me you knew I designed the retention framework. Silence. Tell me you knew Diane stays because of me. Silence. Tell me you knew Graham almost left, twice. Ethan's hands were shaking. I didn't know because you didn't tell me. I told you everything that mattered, Natalie said quietly. You just weren't listening. Carolyn intervened. I think we need to table this conversation and reconvene with a clearer agenda. But before we do, I want to ask Natalie directly, what would it take for you to continue contributing to this firm in an official capacity? Natalie had known this question was coming. She'd thought about the answer for weeks. And now, in this moment, with everyone watching, she said it clearly. Equity, a title that reflects my actual role, decision-making authority, and public acknowledgement of my contributions to the firm's foundational systems. She paused. I don't want an apology. I don't want Ethan removed. I just want the truth to be visible. I want to stop being infrastructure and start being a partner. Carolyn looked at the other board members. I think we need to discuss this privately and come back with a proposal. Agreed, Graham said. The board members nodded. Carolyn turned back to Natalie. Can you give us 48 hours? Yes, Natalie said. The meeting adjourned. Natalie closed her laptop and sat very still. She'd done it. She'd named the truth in front of witnesses. She'd made the invisible visible. And now the structure Ethan had built on her erasure was cracking in real time. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel angry. She just felt solid, grounded, real. For the first time in 6 years, she existed in her own story. And no one could pretend she didn't. 48 hours later, Carolyn called Natalie directly. The board has voted unanimously to offer you a formal partnership, 20% equity, title of Chief Strategy Officer, equal decision-making authority with Ethan, and a public announcement acknowledging your role in building the firm's operational and relational foundation. Natalie closed her eyes. And Ethan agreed to this? He didn't have a choice, Carolyn said. 3 board members made it clear that if you walk, they're pulling their support. Graham said the same, and Diane sent a follow-up email saying she'll only renew her contract if you're formally recognized as a partner. Natalie felt something shift. Not triumph, just relief. The relief of being seen after years of invisibility. I accept, she said. Good. We'll draft the paperwork this week. Welcome to the partnership, Natalie. Natalie hung up and sat in the quiet of her apartment. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 years ago. The one who believed love meant disappearing, who thought devotion required silence. She thought about the cost of that belief. The years she'd spent erasing herself, the moments she'd let pass without claiming them. And she thought about the woman she was now, the one who had finally stopped performing, who had let the truth carry its own weight, who had refused to keep building a world where she didn't exist. She opened her laptop and sent an email to Diane. Subject, partnership. Body, I'm in. Let's build something worth keeping. She hit send, and then she smiled. Not because she'd won, but because she'd finally stopped losing herself. The power hadn't come from destroying Ethan. It had come from refusing to keep holding up a story that erased her. And when she'd let go, the truth had done the rest. 3 months later, Natalie sat in her new office. The one with her name on the door, Chief Strategy Officer. The letters were small, tasteful, permanent. She ran her fingers over them sometimes when she arrived in the morning, still getting used to the weight of visibility. The firm had stabilized. Diane's company had renewed their contract, expanded it actually, now that Natalie was formally leading the relationship. 2 other clients had followed suit, saying they were glad to see her role finally reflected in the structure. Graham had stopped talking about leaving. The employees who'd been quietly job hunting had stayed. Everything Natalie had said would happen when she stopped holding things together invisibly had happened. Not as destruction, just as revelation. The truth had simply become too heavy to ignore. Ethan was still CEO. That had been part of Natalie's terms. She didn't want his position. She didn't want to humiliate him. She just wanted to exist beside him as an equal, visible and valued. But the dynamic had changed in ways that couldn't be reversed. Ethan no longer made decisions without consulting her. He introduced her in meetings as a CO founder now, his voice careful, almost tentative. He asked her opinion before presenting strategies to the board. He deferred to her on client relationships, on operational decisions, on the foundational systems that actually made the firm work. His confidence had become quieter, more cautious, like he was walking on ground he'd just discovered was less solid than he'd believed. Natalie didn't take pleasure in that. She just noticed it, the way you notice when a structure finally shows its true weight distribution. She was working through emails when her assistant knocked. Ethan was asking if she had time to talk. Alone. Natalie hesitated, then nodded. Send him in. Ethan entered and closed the door behind him. He looked tired. Older somehow, though only 3 months had passed. He sat in the chair across from her desk without waiting for an invitation, then seemed to realize what he'd done and half stood again. Sorry, should I? Sit, Natalie said. It's fine. He sat, looked at his hands. I wanted to talk about us, not the business. Us. Natalie set down her pen and gave him her full attention. She didn't make it easy, didn't fill the silence, just waited. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Ethan began. About me not seeing you. About taking credit for work I didn't do. He paused. I didn't think that's what I was doing. I really didn't. But I've been going through old files, old emails, and I'm seeing it now. How much of what I thought was mine was actually yours? Natalie didn't respond. She just let him continue. The investor pitch that saved our Series B, you restructured that. The client retention framework, you designed it. The relationship with Diane. You built that over 3 years while I didn't even know her name. His voice cracked slightly. I don't know how I didn't see it. I don't know how I convinced myself I'd done all that alone. You saw what you wanted to see, Natalie said quietly. And I made it easy for you. I handed you my work and let you believe it was yours because I thought that's what love looked like. I never asked you to do that. You didn't have to. I volunteered. I erased myself because I thought it would make you love me more. She paused. But it just made me invisible. Ethan's eyes were red. I did love you. I do love you. You loved what I gave you, Natalie said. You didn't love me. You didn't even see me. I see you now. Only because I forced you to. Only because I stopped performing the version of myself that made your life easy. Ethan looked down. Is there any way to fix this? Not the business. I know we're partners now. I mean us, the relationship. Natalie had been expecting this question. She'd thought about the answer for weeks, turning it over in her mind like a stone she was trying to understand the weight of. I don't know, she said honestly. I don't know if I can be with someone I had to disappear for. I don't know if I can trust you to see me when it's easier not to. I want to try, Ethan said. I want to be better. I want to learn how to actually see you. That's not something I can teach you, Natalie said gently. That's work you have to do on your own, and I can't wait around while you figure out if you're capable of it. So that's it? We're done? Natalie looked at him. At the man she'd loved for 6 years. The man she'd built and rebuilt and held together. The man who'd worn her thoughts as his own skin. She didn't hate him. That was the truth of it. She just didn't trust him anymore. Not with the parts of herself that mattered. I don't know if we're done, she said. But I know I'm not going to keep shrinking myself to fit inside your understanding of me. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be with the real me. The one who takes up space. The one who has her own ambitions and needs and voice. Not the one who disappears so you can shine. Ethan nodded slowly. I understand. Do you? I'm trying to. Natalie softened slightly. That's the best you've said so far. Ethan managed a weak smile. Can I ask you something? Okay. Did you let the Hartley and Stone pitch fail on purpose? To prove a point? Natalie had known this question would come eventually too. She met his eyes directly. I didn't make it fail. I just stopped preventing it from failing. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. For 6 years, I protected you from the consequences of not paying attention. I filled in gaps you didn't know existed. I solved problems before they became visible, and you started believing that's just how the world worked, that success came easily because you were talented. She paused. But it didn't come easily. It came because I was working invisibly, and when I stopped, the truth became obvious. You could have warned me. You could have asked me, Natalie said. You could have spent 6 years being curious about what I actually contributed instead of assuming I was just supportive. You could have wondered how deals closed and relationships stayed strong and crises got resolved. But you didn't, because it was easier to believe it was all you. Ethan absorbed that. You're right, I should have asked. I should have seen you. Yes, Natalie said simply. You should have. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Ethan stood. I'm sorry, Natalie. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am sorry. I know, she said. And I appreciate that. He lingered at the door. For what it's worth, I'm glad you're finally getting the recognition you deserve, even if I had to be humiliated for it to happen. It wasn't about humiliating you, Natalie said. It was about me refusing to stay invisible. Ethan nodded. I know. He left. Natalie sat alone in her office and let out a long breath. She felt tired, but it was a clean tired, the kind that comes after you've finally set down something heavy you've been carrying too long. She didn't know what would happen with Ethan. Maybe they'd find a way back to each other. Maybe they wouldn't. But she knew that whatever happened, she wouldn't disappear again. She'd spent too long learning what it cost to be invisible. She wasn't going to forget. That evening, Natalie went home to the apartment she'd started renting a month ago. Small, just hers. No one else's energy in the space. No one else's expectations. Just her books and her coffee maker and her own quiet. She made dinner, poured a glass of wine, sat by the window and watched the city lights flicker on as the sky darkened. Her phone buzzed. An email from Diane. Subject line, new partnership opportunity. Body? I've been talking to some colleagues about the work you and I have been doing together. 3 companies want to know if you'd be interested in consulting independently. Not through Ethan's firm, just you. Thought you should know the option exists. Natalie read it twice. Then she set her phone down and looked out at the city. A year ago, the idea of working independently would have terrified her. She'd built her entire identity around being part of Ethan's vision. She'd told herself she wasn't the kind of person who led. She was the kind of person who supported. But that had been a story she'd told herself to make invisibility bearable. It hadn't been true. The truth was simpler and more powerful. She was good at this work. She understood systems and relationships and the invisible architecture that held things together. She didn't need Ethan's platform. She'd been building her own all along. She just hadn't let herself see it. Natalie picked up her phone and started typing a response to Diane. I'm interested. Let's set up a call. She hit send. Then she opened her laptop and started a new document. Titled it, What I Actually Want. And for the first time in 6 years, she let herself write without editing, without making it smaller, without translating her ambitions into someone else's language. She wrote about the kind of work that made her feel alive, the kind of clients she wanted to serve, the kind of impact she wanted to have, the kind of life she wanted to build. Not the life she thought she deserved, not the life that made her easy to love, but the life that made her feel whole. She wrote for 2 hours. When she finally stopped, her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, from something that felt like waking up. She saved the document, closed her laptop, and sat in the quiet her own space, feeling the weight of her own possibilities. Natalie Rivers had spent 6 years making herself invisible. She believed that's what love required. That partnership meant erasure. That devotion meant silence. But she'd learned something in the months since she stopped performing. Silence wasn't weakness. It was discernment. It was the choice to stop filling spaces that weren't hers to fill. It was the refusal to keep authoring a story where she didn't exist. And when she'd finally chosen her own visibility over someone else's comfort, the world hadn't ended. It had just rearranged itself around the truth. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't hurt. She was just clear. Clear about her worth. Clear about her boundaries. Clear about the difference between love and self-abandonment. She didn't need Ethan to validate her. She didn't need the board to recognize her. She didn't need external proof that she mattered. She just needed to stop betraying herself. And she had. Natalie stood and walked to the window, pressed her palm against the cool glass, looked out at the sprawling city below, all those lives and stories and invisible labors holding the world upright. She thought about all the people out there who were doing what she'd done, making themselves small, giving credit away, building empires for people who'd forgotten to see them. She thought about the moment they'd realize what she'd realized. That silence could be power. That withdrawal could be clarity. That the truth had weight even when no one else acknowledged it. And she hoped they'd find the courage to stop disappearing. Because the world didn't need more invisible people. It needed more people who knew their worth and refused to negotiate it away. Natalie smiled at her own reflection in the glass. The woman looking back at her was someone she recognized, not the one who'd learned to shrink, not the one who'd translated herself into someone else's language, the one who'd been there all along, underneath the performance, waiting. She was done waiting. She was done being quiet in the way that cost her voice. She was done authoring stories where she wasn't the protagonist. She was finally, fully, undeniably here. And no one could make her disappear again. Not even herself. Natalie's story isn't just about one woman and one betrayal. It's about something that happens in 1,000 small moments, in offices and homes and relationships everywhere. The slow disappearance that comes from mistaking self-erasure for love. Maybe you've felt it. That pull to make yourself smaller so someone else can feel bigger. To give away your ideas and let someone else take credit because you told yourself it didn't matter who. Got recognized as long as the work got done. To translate your intelligence into someone else's language because direct claiming felt too bold, too much, too risky. Maybe you've been the one solving problems no one else saw. Maintaining relationships no one else valued. Holding structures together while someone else stood in front of them and accepted applause. And maybe you told yourself that's what partnership looked like. That real love, real loyalty, real devotion meant not needing credit, not needing visibility, not needing your contributions to have your name attached. But here's what Natalie learned, and what might be true for you too. There's a difference between humility and erasure, between supporting someone and disappearing for them, between partnership and the slow death of being chronically unseen. When your labor becomes invisible, you're not being noble. You're teaching people that your presence doesn't require gratitude, that your contributions don't need acknowledgement, that you'll keep building their world even when they forget you're the architect. And over time, that becomes the truth they believe. Not because they're cruel, but because humans believe what the structure teaches them. And if the structure says your work appears magically, requiring no effort and no recognition, then that's the story they'll tell themselves. This is where information asymmetry becomes quietly powerful. When you're the one doing invisible labor, you're often the only person who sees the whole system. You know which relationships are real and which are transactional. You know which successes were earned and which were inherited. You know what would collapse if you stopped holding it up? That knowledge isn't a weapon, but it is power. The power of simply seeing clearly while others perform confidence over competence. Natalie didn't destroy Ethan. She didn't have to. She just stopped protecting him from the truth. She withdrew her invisible labor and let the structure show its actual weight distribution. And when she did, everything she'd said became undeniable. Not because she fought, but because the truth has gravity. If you're in a relationship, a workplace, a friendship where your contributions are consistently absorbed without acknowledgement, here's what you need to know. You're not being humble. You're being erased. And every moment you stay silent, you confirm the story that you don't matter. Real partnership requires visibility. It requires two people who can see each other's contributions and name them out loud. It requires someone noticing when you're carrying weight and saying, "Thank you, I see you, I couldn't do this without you," and meaning the specific work, not the general presence. If the person you're building with can't name what you actually do, that's not partnership. That's dependency dressed up as collaboration. So what do you do when you realize you've been disappearing? When you've spent years making someone else's life possible and they've forgotten you were doing it? You stop. Not dramatically, not with announcements. You just stop filling gaps you were never asked to fill. You stop solving problems before they become visible. You stop translating your intelligence into someone else's voice. And then, you wait. You watch what becomes undeniable when you're no longer hiding the truth under performances of effortless support. Some people will notice. They'll ask why things feel different. They'll start seeing the architecture they'd been taking for granted. Those are the people worth staying for. But some people won't notice until something breaks. Until a deal falls through, until a relationship collapses, until the invisible labor they'd been depending on simply stops. And when that happens, you'll know exactly how much they valued you versus how much they valued what you provided. That knowledge is painful, but it's also clarifying, because you can't build a life on someone else's inability to see you. You can't wait for people to suddenly develop the vision they've been lacking for years. You can't fix structural blindness with more invisible labor. You can only choose yourself. Choose your own visibility. Choose to exist in your own story instead of being the unnamed supporting character in someone else's. Natalie didn't win because she destroyed someone. She won because she stopped abandoning herself. She reclaimed the space she'd been taught to vacate. She let the truth carry its own weight instead of managing everyone's comfort with her erasure. And the most powerful thing she did was this: she stopped being silent in the way that cost her her voice. She started being silent in the way that forced other people to finally listen. Because here's what silence can be when you choose it consciously. It can be observation. It can be refusal. It can be the space where you stop performing and start seeing clearly. It can be the withdrawal of the infrastructure that lets people avoid accountability. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's the most honest thing you can speak, the clearest boundary you can set, the loudest truth you can tell. Your silence might be saying, "I'm done making this easy for you. I'm done pretending your success is separate from my labor. I'm done disappearing so you can shine." And when you let that silence do its work, when you stop rushing in to fix and smooth and translate and manage, the truth becomes structural. It's not something you have to argue. It's something people run into when they reach for the support that's no longer there. So if you're tired of being invisible, here's your permission. Stop performing the version of yourself that makes other people comfortable. Stop giving away your work and pretending it doesn't cost you. Stop waiting for someone to finally see you when you've spent years making yourself unseeable. Choose visibility, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it disrupts the story other people have been telling about how things work. Even when it means some relationships won't survive the truth. Because you deserve to exist in your own story. You deserve to have your contributions acknowledged. You deserve partnerships where you don't have to shrink to fit. And the people who can't see you? The ones who mistake your silence for agreement and your support for subordination? The ones who've built their empires on your invisible labor and convinced themselves it was all their own? You don't owe them another year, another month, another moment of making yourself small. You just owe yourself the truth. And the courage to let it be visible. Natalie found that courage. And when she did, she didn't just reclaim her power. She reclaimed herself. The version that had been waiting underneath all that performance. The one who knew her worth without needing permission to claim it. That version of you exists too. Underneath the accommodation, underneath the silence that costs you your voice, underneath the years of translating yourself into other people's languages. And the moment you stop betraying that version of yourself is the moment everything changes. Not because the world suddenly values you, but because you finally do. And that, more than any external recognition, is what freedom actually feels like. If Natalie's story resonated with you, you're not alone. There are thousands of people who felt erased, underestimated, invisibly essential. People who stayed quiet while others assumed they were weak, and who finally realized that silence doesn't have to mean surrender. This is what we do here at Silent Mind Stories. We tell the stories of people who were underestimated, who built empires no one acknowledged, who loved people who forgot to see them, who stayed patient while others performed, and who discovered that the quietest power is often the most dangerous kind. These are stories about dignity, about clarity, about the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself because it's holding everything upright. If you want more stories like this, stories that remind you that your worth isn't determined by who's paying attention, that invisibility is a choice, not a destiny, that the truth always has weight even when no one else can see it yet, then subscribe to Silent Mind Stories. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Become part of a community that believes being underestimated is a temporary condition, not a permanent identity. Because the world needs more people like Natalie. People who know that silence can be power. That patience can be strategy. That sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is stop holding up a world that refuses to acknowledge you're the one keeping it from collapsing. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, your silence might be the loudest truth you ever speak.